Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 5 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. After President Johnson took off from Dallas Love Field in Air Force One, which contained the big, heavy casket into which President Kennedy's body had been placed at Parkland Hospital, wrapped in white sheets, Johnson headed to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. He landed there shortly before 6 p.m. Once the front door is open to the plane, Bobby Kennedy immediately goes onto the plane, goes right past Johnson, doesn't even acknowledge him. As I indicated earlier, Kennedy hated Johnson and Johnson hated Kennedy. So Kennedy goes right by him, doesn't say anything to him, and goes directly to Mrs. Kennedy in an obvious attempt to console her and to escort her off the plane. In the meantime, people are now starting to remove this heavy casket, which was extremely difficult. You'll recall that President Johnson had had seats removed from the back of the plane to make room for the casket. And that was so that Roy Kellerman's team would be able to, once they arrived there, would be able to hand over the casket. It could be quickly loaded onto the plane. So the casket finally is offloaded off the plane, and it's put into a gray Navy ambulance. Mrs. Kennedy gets into that plane, into that car. Bobby Kennedy gets into the car. Other people do too. And the car starts making its way to the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. That's a military facility. And as I indicated earlier, nobody questioned this. It was all normal. This was a military nation. This was the height of the Cold War. So it was considered just perfectly normal for the president's autopsy to be conducted not by the civilian authorities in Dallas, which was required to perform the autopsy under state law because it was a murder case, and not by the civilian authorities in the Washington, D.C. area, but by the military authorities. That was Johnson's clearly assigned role. Get this body out of Parkland without letting them have an autopsy, getting it onto Air Force One, and putting it in the hands of the military. And so it's not surprising that the autopsy is going to be conducted at a military facility, specifically in the morgue that was in the back of this naval center that the Navy Gray ambulance was headed toward. So it arrives there shortly before 7 p.m., like 6:55 or so. And Mrs. Kennedy gets off the vehicle, and so does Bobby Kennedy, and they go into the front entrance of this facility, and they head over to an elevator, and they go up to, I think, the 17th floor where there's a suite where they can sit there and wait until the autopsy is completed, which would take 2 to 3 hours. And then there's the embalming, which takes more time. In the meantime, the Navy Gray ambulance stays out in front of the building for quite some time, 15, 20 minutes, something like that. But it ultimately ends up in the back of the building on a lower level, which is the morgue entrance. At that point, a Navy honor guard that consists of all of the representatives, or one representative from each of the armed forces, all dressed up in their dress uniforms, the Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. Their job is to offload this heavy casket out of the Navy Gray ambulance and carry it into the morgue. This was all detailed in what's called an after-action report that was written by the head of this team, this honor guard, a man named Lieutenant Samuel Byrd. The following week, after all this took place, he detailed all this in an after-action report in which he stated that his team carried the casket in at 8 p.m. And then the body is taken out and the autopsy begins at 8:15 p.m. Now that's the official narrative. Okay. Now let me go over the highlights of the timetable, because the timetable is extremely important here. Okay. Johnson lands at Andrews Air Force Base about 6:55 or so. Casket is put in the Navy gray ambulance. It starts making its way around to the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. It arrives there shortly before 7 p.m. Then ultimately it stays there for several minutes. Then ultimately at 8 p.m., it's there at the morgue. And Lieutenant Byrd's team removes it. He points out in his after-action report that that's at 8 p.m., and then the autopsy begins at 8:15 p.m. Now, you'll recall that we discussed the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB. This was the independent agency charged with enforcing the JFK Records Collection Act. I should have pointed out when I talked about the ARRB that it wasn't totally independent. It actually fell under the control of the executive branch, i.e. the president. But for all practical purposes, it was an independently operating agency in enforcing this law. And you'll recall the JFK Records Act required all federal agencies to disclose and reveal to the public, put them in the National Archives, all of their assassination-related records that they had kept secret for some 30 years. And that, of course, had been pointed out in Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which had brought the public pressure on to bring into existence the JFK Records Act and, of course, also the ARRB to enforce the act. Well, in the late 1990s, the ARRB discovers the existence of a man named Roger Boygin. And they contact Boyajian, and Boyajian talks to them, and he tells them a fascinating story. On the day of the assassination, Boyajian was a Marine Sergeant who was stationed at the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. Soon after President Kennedy was declared dead, and it was determined that the autopsy would be held at this facility, Boyajian received orders to report to the facility to establish security, along with a team of soldiers. And so he goes over there, and he ultimately establishes security, but he tells the ARRB that his team brought the president's body into the morgue at 6:35 p.m. Now, keep in mind the timeline again. The plane lands at about 5 to 7 at Andrews. The Navy gray ambulance comes around and gets to the front of the facility at 6:55 p.m. Stays there a while and then ultimately ends up at the back of the morgue, and the casket is brought in at 8 p.m. That's the official narrative. That is still the narrative today. And all of a sudden, you've got this former Marine Sergeant saying that body was brought in at 6:35 p.m. into the morgue. How can this be? Now, there's something you should note that I find very interesting about this. Guess how many mainstream reporters, investigative reporters, decide to check into this? I mean, to me, this is a remarkable, strange, very important revelation. When a president's body is being sneaked into a morgue almost an hour and a half before the official entry time, that's something worth investigating. I mean, if this guy is lying, I mean, why not expose him? But what's interesting about this is that nobody called him a liar. And at this point in the 90s, there are still a lot of people living that participated in the autopsy. In fact, the 3 pathologists who performed the autopsy, James Humes, Navy, J. Thornton Boswell, Navy, and Colonel Pierre Fink, Army, were all alive. And none of them stood up saying, that man's a liar, that man's a liar. He's making all this up. The Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't say that. Nobody from the Pentagon accused Boyajian of making up the story. And yet not one investigative reporter from the mainstream press said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Because it seems to me this is something worth getting to the bottom of. I mean, why would they sneak the body into the morgue? And why would they lie about it? And why would they cover it up? And why would they continue covering it up all the way into the 90s and beyond? Now, you all know what's the standard response whenever we bring up regime change operations in the Kennedy assassination. Conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. Okay, fine, conspiracy theory. But explain to me why the body was brought in early. See, that's what they never do. They always cry conspiracy theory, or they'll have these long articles analyzing conspiracy theories, where they say, well, we're going to analyze why people delve into conspiracy theories like in the JFK assassination. Or they'll do documentaries. Y'all have seen the documentaries about, we're here to study the phenomenon of conspiracy theories in America, to see why Americans go into conspiracy theories. Does it relate to their childhood or their birth or their upbringing? And, it's all this, really sophisticated analytical stuff on conspiracy theories. But notice something really important about all this. They never explain why the body was brought in early. Never. And they certainly could do that. I mean, there's nothing that prevents these people from explaining that in the context of their analytical perspectives on conspiracy theories. All they'd have to do, like in a documentary, say, we're here to analyze. We have analyzed very carefully in this documentary why people subscribe to conspiracy theories, like in the Kennedy assassination. Oh, by the way, we want to explain why the body was brought in early into the Bethesda morgue. Okay? That's all they have to do. Or people that write articles along these lines, all they'd have to do is say at the very end of the article, by the way, we want to explain why the body was brought in early, that there's an innocent explanation for the lies and the cover-ups that have taken place all these years. They don't do that. Or they could write a separate article saying, hey, we want to explain why the body was brought in early. Nothing. It's all just conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. And yet, here's Marine Sgt. Boygin saying, we brought the body in at 6:35 p.m. Almost an hour and a half before the official entry time. Okay, so you might say, well, Jacob, it's just one guy. Yeah, it's one guy, but he appears to be a fairly credible guy. But the fact is that there is corroboration. Remember, I talked about an after-action report from Lieutenant Byrd that after the following week he issued that report stating that he and his honored guard had carried the body in at 8 p.m. Well, guess what? Sergeant Boyajian did an after-action report too, and he submitted to his superior officers a written report stating that his team brought the body in at 6:35 p.m. or a team brought the body in at 6:35 p.m. So there's two after-action reports. The problem, however, is that Boygin's after-action report is gone. The military never produced it to the Warren Commission. They never produced it to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. You'll recall that was the second group that was official group that was investigating the Kennedy assassination. That was after Geraldo Rivera showed the Zapruder film on national TV, and people were so outraged because it showed Kennedy being flung to the back and to the left, indicating a shot from the front, that the House Select Committee was under pressure, and they started this new investigation. But the military never turned over Boygin's after-action report to the House Select Committee. And then throughout the 90s, while the ARRB was enforcing this law, and the military knew that they were required to turn over all assassination-related records, they didn't turn over Boygin's report. They never have. And now, if there's anything that's assassination-related, it's this after-action report that says we brought the president's body in at 6:35 p.m. Now, my own hunch is that the reason that they've never delivered that document over to the National Archives pursuant to this law, the JFK Records Collection Act, is because my hunch is they destroyed it immediately afterward. But what they didn't count on was that Boygin would keep a copy of that report. Yes, this former Marine, who obviously lives a very organized and structured life, had kept a copy of this report that was more than 30 years old. Now, in 63, they didn't have Xerox machines, and so it had to be kind of like one of those onion skin copies or carbon paper copies. Nonetheless, it was a copy of the report, and the guy had kept it. And he told the ARRB that he had a copy of his report. So the ARRB says, would you mind sending us that copy or making a copy and sending it to us? And he says, no, not at all. I'll send it to you. And so the ARRB comes into possession of this after-action report that specifically says 6:35 p.m. Now, don't you think that this would be enough for some investigative reporter saying, okay, this is good corroboration. We need to get to the bottom of this. Now, keep in mind something really important here. Remember I told you that there was a couple of very unusual things about the JFK Records Collection Act? One of those things was that the ARRB was prohibited by the law from investigating anything they came across. Anything unusual, any anomaly or mysterious or even a sinister thing, they were absolutely prohibited from investigating. And the ARRB Board of Trustees strictly enforced this aspect of the law. There was going to be no exceptions as far as the board was concerned. And they made it clear to every staff member that if a staff member was caught investigating any aspect of the assassination, they were subject to being fired. And there were people on the staff that were watching for this. And if they saw somebody doing what they thought was investigating some aspect of the assassination, they would call them on it. And all this is detailed in Doug Horne's book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. You'll recall that this is the book that had the monumental impact on me. It is a book that put the whole thing about the Kennedy assassination into a context where all the pieces fit in a very logical, coherent whole, where you could see what happened here, even though you only had, let's say, 80% of the jigsaw puzzle. You could see the puzzle depicted a regime change operation, much like a real puzzle would depict the Eiffel Tower, even though you only had 80% of the pieces. And Horne talks about what life was like while he was working for the ARRB in this 5-volume set. And he was detailing that this was what was going on. They could not investigate. So here they come across Roger Boygin and his after-action report. They can't investigate it. They can't get to the bottom of it. But you see, that's what an investigative reporter can do. I mean, that's what the mainstream press is. In fact, we all know that there's a lot of disrespect, a lack of trust in the mainstream press. Much more trust in what's going on the internet than on the mainstream press. And my hunch is that the lack of trust in the mainstream press goes all the way back to November 22nd, 1963. Because the mainstream press clearly abrogated its responsibility. It operated essentially much like the press in the Soviet Union or in Russia today. You defer to the military. This is a military nation. The military is running things, and we've got to defer to them. And there's a sort of a dance that's performed between the mainstream press and the Pentagon, and they look to the Pentagon to get their cues. Is it okay to address this? Is it okay to talk about this? And sometimes the signals are very subtle. But when the Pentagon doesn't want something discussed or the CIA doesn't want something discussed, that is communicated in some way, sometimes indirectly, subtly, through this little dance that takes place between them, sometimes very directly. And then the mainstream press just defers. And that's what happened here with the Boygin Matter, because this is an investigative journalist, reporter's greatest dream. I mean, here's a Marine sergeant that's questioning the entire official narrative of what happened on the introduction of the president's body into the morgue. The official narrative is that body was brought in this Dallas heavy ornate casket at 8 p.m. Here's a Marine sergeant with a copy of a written report saying that body was brought in at 6:25 p.m. That's something worth investigating. I mean, every investigative reporter, these are, instinctively. But no, 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 no. You can't do this. It's verboten. It's prohibited. It's almost like, do you recall in the former Soviet Union, there would be Soviet officials that would fall out of favor with the Kremlin, and they would be cast out, possibly even executed. And they would go into all the photographs and reports and stuff, historical records mentioning that person, and they would airbrush them out. They would airbrush them out of the photographs, and they remove their names from the historical accounts. It was as if they just never existed. And so, young people growing up, they never heard of that person because the person doesn't appear in the photographs, and he's been removed from the historical accounts of what happened. So it's just disappeared. And the mainstream press in the Soviet Union would go along with this. Everybody would go along. Nobody would question it. You couldn't mention that person who'd been airbrushed out. Well, this is exactly what happened, like with Boygin's report. It's just airbrushed out of the official accounts of what happened at the Bethesda morgue. It just doesn't exist. It's almost like we live in a parallel universe, okay? In fiction, science fiction, you have parallel universes, two universes existing at the same time. Well, you've got this universe over here where it says the body was taken off the plane, put in the Navy ambulance, comes around, it's at the front of the building at 6:55 p.m., and then it's brought all the way to the back of the morgue ultimately, and 8 p.m., it's offloaded. Autopsy begins at 8:15 p.m. That's the official narrative. That's one universe here. The other universe is the one that consists of Roger Boygin's statement in his after-action report that says the body came in at 6:35 p.m. So you've got these two parallel universes going on here. And essentially, out of the official narrative, they never discuss this. They never mention it. It's been airbrushed out of that universe. It just did not happen. And it really goes to show you, the deference to authority that the mainstream press took after this assassination. Many of you are familiar with Operation Mockingbird, where the Pentagon and the CIA actually had overt assets in the mainstream press. I mean, these were people in the mainstream press. This was at the height of the Cold War. Okay, and so the mindset that had been inculcated in the American people by the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA was that the Russians were coming to get us. I mean, there was a tremendous fear of Russians, and it was clear that this communist regime in Moscow was they were coming to get us. They were going to take over our country. They were going to teach Marxism in the public, i.e., government schools here in America, and that was what everything was all about. The whole Cold War was the Russians are coming, and there was a deep hostility that the Pentagon and the CIA had instilled. If you take the hostility that Americans today have been inculcated with, anti-Russia hostility, and multiply it by about 1,000, that's what life was like during the Cold War. And so a lot of these mainstream journalists, investigative reporters, and so forth, they thought they were doing a patriotic thing by joining up with the CIA and serving as assets for the CIA. And that's what Operation Mockingbird was all about. In fact, one of the things that you might be interested to know that you might not know is that the term conspiracy theorist was popularized by virtue of a CIA propaganda campaign that related to the Kennedy assassination. What happened was that the more and more people, as time was going on, were starting to figure out that this whole thing was very suspicious. The whole lone nut narrative, it was very, very pat. Lone nut happens to be at the right place at the right time. Former communist Marine, which is kind of weird because you don't generally find communists in the Marines. But he kills the president, and then everything's shrouded in secrecy. National security. Well, why? And so, people are starting to wonder what the heck's going on, but they don't get answers in the mainstream press because the mainstream press has become deferential. It's a military nation. You don't talk about things like Roger Boygin in the after-action report. So we have this problem here, okay? And there's those that would say, Jacob, just drop it. Drop it. But I can't drop it. Doug Horn can't drop it. We want to know. All you got to do is tell us, why was the body sneaked in early? Because you see, when you're sneaking a body in early, you're generally talking about criminal conduct. Tampering with a body is criminal conduct. And when you're lying about it, then it's compounding the problem. It's making it look even more sinister and more evil. Why did they bring that body in an hour and a half earlier than the official entry time? Equally important, how did they get the body back into the Dallas casket to bring it in at 8 p.m.? You see? How'd they arrange all this? I mean, this is the way my mind works. I want to know. Not the mainstream press. They don't care. It's just whatever the Pentagon says is fine with us. That if they say this is how it happened, that's the way it's going to happen. And that's all there's to it. So we just airbrush this out. That's not good enough for me. Okay? It's not good enough for Doug Horn and a lot of other assassination researchers. We want to know. All right, so you might say, well, Jacob, okay, it's just one guy, right? It's just one guy with his report. I mean, really, we're going to make a big deal of this? Well, it's not exactly one guy and one report. There's a guy named Dennis David, who was a hospital corpsman on November 22nd, 1963, there at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. He also talked to the ARRB. And let me tell you what he says. That he was the chief of the day on that day. That's a title there in the Navy. And by the way, he was an enlisted man, but he later became an officer, a Navy officer. He was assigned to head a security team, just like Boygin was. He told the ARRB that he and his team met a black hearse, big black vehicle that had a casket in the back of it. And that he and his team carried this casket in to the morgue that contained President Kennedy's body. Was it the big, heavy, ornate casket? No, it wasn't. It was a shipping casket. A type of casket that's used to ship bodies into different parts of the country. They call it a shipping casket. It's a sort of a cheap metallic casket that you just remove the top, very lightweight, and that's what they use to ship bodies. Well, Dennis David tells the ARRB that they meet this hearse and there's men with suits in there. Now, we don't know who these men are. Okay, they're men in suits. They could be Secret Service, they could be FBI, they could be CIA. My hunch is CIA, but we don't know. And the military and the CIA have never talked. Because you see, they don't acknowledge that this took place. This is the universe where all this has been airbrushed out. And so Dennis David says they carried this shipping casket into the morgue. So he also at around 6:30. He mentions that this was around 6:30, which sort of is near the time, the 6:35 mark that Boyajian had said. He also says that at 6:55 he saw the Navy gray ambulance show up in front of the building and saw Mrs. Kennedy come out. And that he knew that casket in that Navy gray ambulance had to be empty because they had carried the body in, like almost half an hour before, like 25 minutes before. The Navy gray ambulance, remember, arrives at 6:55. The body's brought in the cheap shipping casket at 6:25 by Dennis David's team. And in fact, Dennis David had told this story back in 1975. So it's not like he just shows up in the 1990s and he's going to make up this story. He had told this story to a local newspaper in his hometown in 1975. And why 1975? Well, this was the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So now we have two people establishing that President Kennedy's body was brought into the morgue at 6:35 p.m. in a cheap shipping casket rather than the Dallas ornate casket, which of course raises the question I initially said: how do they get the body back into the Dallas casket? So you say, okay, Jacob, that's only two people. Is that enough? Well, it's not only two people, as it turns out. As we will see in the next episode of this series, there's even more very persuasive corroborative evidence. In fact, my hunch is that when we finish all of the corroborative evidence on this early sneaking of the president's body into the morgue, you're not only going to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the body was brought into the morgue at 6:35 p.m. in a cheap shipping casket, you're going to be convinced beyond all doubt. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 5 of the JFK assassination 60 years later. Thank you for tuning in.